I can't hear you yet. Oh, there we go.
I think.
Hello,
there you go.
I think I have. Yes. Good morning.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, I'm Dan.
Hi, Dan. And Julia, is it?
No, I'm Laurel, actually. I'm the intern.
Hi,
that
Laurel.
works with Julia, but I'm just setting it up for
Great.
today.
Thank you very much.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you, Laurel.
Nice to see you, Dan.
Nice to see you. Thank you so much for doing this.
Oh, an absolute pleasure. I just wish it had been in person.
Yeah, well, we have to take what we can get these days.
That's right.
How is the virus there? I heard it's a little better there than it is here.
Yeah, well, I'm in Canberra and we have had, I think, over 100 days virus-free for no transmission. So we're very, very fortunate. Even within the Australian context, we've been one of the really successful areas. I'm originally from Melbourne, and Melbourne, as you may have heard, had the most dramatic spike, but they seem to have got it down by being in lockdown for a very long time.
Yeah, well, you have a distinct advantage over us in that you have a functioning government.
Yes, indeed.
And I think that makes a difference.
Yeah, it sure does. It shows the institutional frameworks are very significant in every aspect of our lives.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So what time is it there?
So it's 10 to 9 in the morning here.
Oh, good.
And,
I thought it was going to be more brutal for you, so
no,
I don't feel quite so guilty.
No, I think, in fact, I think Katie, knowing Katie, probably tried to organise it in a time so it wasn't too brutal. I must say, though, I've had a very busy couple of days. So I gave a public lecture last night and I've been on the radio already this morning. So I hope my weariness doesn't come through in the context of this, and it won't, because I'm really looking forward to it.
Oh, I'm sure it'll be great. I think we're going for an hour.
That's right.
That's
yes.
your understanding too? Okay,
that's my understanding, yes. Katie and I had a lovely catch up, and she sent those notes about our thinking, but we did frame it within the hour. So
that's great.
Katie, are you
I'd love to talk to you sometime about citizenship too, by the way. Maybe we can have a follow-up conversation.
Maybe,
this
let's
is my
do
area.
That. Yes, indeed, indeed. Your name is very familiar to me. Amicus brief that was, I mean, in the US, there are lots of amicus briefs, which is an interesting contrast to Australia, which is another conversation. But I was part of the amicus brief of professors of statelessness in the Flores decision, the case in relation to citizenship by descent.
Yeah.
For children born outside of the US to, American fathers as opposed to, and there was a fascinating experience being involved with that. So that aspect is one of the many aspects of, but you'll hear in my comments today that my last point is in relation to institutional racism in the context of citizenship laws.
Well, that's good, because I was hoping we'd get into that a little bit if we have time.
Great.
I tend to think of it as the last legitimate form of bigotry.
Yes, or legitimize as opposed.
Yeah, legitimize
exactly. Rather than legitimate. Yeah.
Exactly.
Hello, Katie.
Hello. G'day.
Great to see you again.
Great to see you. Hi, Laurel. Nice to meet you.
Hi, good to meet you too.
Yeah, I just jumped on and I had some virtual background. I don't know. I think one of my kids has been interfering and I had to spend 5 minutes. I'm glad we got here early.
Yes. Yeah, fantastic. Excellent.
So Katie, I have gone ahead and made you the host. You should be able to tell that on your side, which will allow you to broadcast and end the call whenever you want to. It does look like Julia set it up to record from my perspective. So I'm going to probably turn my video off and stay on and let it record through the whole session. And then I'll turn it off once it ends, because I think it's going to interrupt the recording otherwise. So
then
I'll be here, but Katie's the host.
As moderator, I'll make a point of telling everybody that it's being recorded, because we have to do that under Massachusetts law anyway.
Yeah.
And I have
with these
cloud talks that everyone's screen is being recorded all the time, just so you know.
Oh, that's good to know.
When I just saw an archived cloud, I noticed everyone was on screen the whole time, and also in real time as well. It's not a rotating screen.
Right. And Katie, in terms of the screen, will the participants also show up, or is it just the speakers who show?
I think Laurel can answer that.
I think no. This is set up as a webinar or a panel.
Webinar.
Just
Yes, great.
those screens
Perfect.
that are here. The caption
Yes.
down below is doing the closed captioning. So I'll
Yes.
turn my video off for the duration of it, and it'll just be this image.
Great.
But
Fantastic. Well,
I
that's-
think I will have access, I guess we all will, to the Q&A list, because
Yeah.
I'm going to tell people to post their questions in the Q&A function rather than chat. I think that
okay.
usually works better. Does everybody agree with that
Happy with that?
methodology?
Yeah, and does that really occur? Because I've been on a few webinars where the participants can't see the questions or the chat.
I don't think the participants will be able to see, but everyone on the screen right now. So once we broadcast, this is what participants will see, but they won't be able to see each other or chat with each other. They'll just chat and send Q&As directly to the panel.
Okay, and then I'll read off the cues.
So you'll need, yes. And I thought I would do a shout out, and in fact I've worked out a way to, as I think I emailed, to just refer to Anne McGrath's book, because there's actually a nice link to the citizenship stuff at the end. And I can put the link to that book in the chat function, I think is right, isn't it?
Great.
So I'll do that at the time.
Although it does sound like participants won't see that chat function.
I thought that they might see the chat, but not the Q&A, but they won't see the chat either?
Normally the participants could see the chat, no? Well, actually, I'm not sure. I shouldn't say. I'm not sure. I think that's up to Laurel here.
You know, I'm not sure either. The webinars that I've been in, the chat has not been available to the participants. But Katie, if you want to click around, maybe because you're the host now, you might have an option to make it visible or not.
When you go into the chat and you click on the two,
it does say all participants and attendees.
Yes, and attendees. So I think they see that, but I don't think they see the Q&A.
I can see that.
Yes, because it says no open questions. Only hosts and panelists can see the questions when you click on Q&A. So we'll be able to see the Q&A, but the attendees won't. But the attendees will be able to see the chat.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's good.
I'll try to sort of curate the questions. I don't know how many we'll have, of course, but sometimes if I can do it on the fly, it's not the easiest thing in the world. But if some of them bunch together, I might just try to combine them in the interest of time. But we'll see how many we've got. Oh, there's Linda.
Hello, how are you?
Hello.
Yeah.
Good morning.
Linda, let me introduce you to Kim Rubenstein.
Hello, Linda.
Good morning,
lovely
where you are, Kim.
Yes, it is. It is 5 to 9 a.m. in the morning, so it's not brutal.
Wow.
It's a civilized time.
Getting a fresh start, right?
I am, although I just said to Dan, I've already done a radio interview this morning, and I gave a big public lecture last night, so I'm feeling quite weary, but I'm not going to let that interfere with my enthusiasm and engagement for this panel. But yes, it's not early. I've been up quite a while, but it's good. It's lovely to be part of it.
Katie, are you teaching this semester?
No, I'm on a sabbatical, Linda.
Where are you located?
My children.
I'm sorry?
I'm teaching my children.
But where are you at home?
Yeah, we're here in Boston.
Yeah. So they're learning remotely, or?
3 days a week it's remote, 2 days they do get to go in.
Yeah. I know what Dan's doing, so I think. Are
you all in Boston?
Yeah, I'm at Boston University. I live in Brookline, which is just right next to Boston. So.
Yes, yeah.
I live in Arlington, which became famous recently for having a rabid raccoon running around. But that is the headline of it, as if we don't have enough to worry about.
Wow.
Yeah. Yes, it's a long time since I was there, but I did do my graduate work in 91, 92 over at Harvard, and then had a separate stint at Georgetown.
Oh, really?
Sabbatical. Yes.
Yeah, I went to Georgetown Law School. Yeah.
Oh, great.
Yeah,
so
it's nicer now than when I went there, though.
Right.
More buildings,
Yes.
Nicer environment, I think, for student life, not as crowded.
Yes, yeah. Well, it's a long time ago for me now, and it sounds, well, on so many different levels, it's a very different place.
Yeah.
In sobering ways relevant to your book.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you for taking the time to to engage with it. This was originally going to be in March, I think, or
yes, indeed.
Yeah.
And in person, it would have been a lovely opportunity to return and see.
I should get it off the shelf in case I need to refer to something.
I've got it right here. If you want me to flip into for you.
I'll just grab it from you.
Kim, all kidding aside, I think we should have an obligation to anybody who participates in a Zoom webinar. We should guarantee an invitation to some in-person event if they want to do it.
That sounds good to me.
So
yeah.
I'd be happy to do that through the Center for Human Rights if the Clow Center can't do it. But
Fantastic.
we should find a way. If that's something you want to do, I'd be happy to try to arrange that.
Eventually, when the world's a little bit more safe, that sounds terrific.
Yeah, well, after November, it'll be a little bit more safe.
Yeah. Wow.
Well, as I said to you earlier, I've been living in a place which has been COVID-free for over 100 days. So it's really wonderful. I mean, there is a semblance of normality here. I feel a bit naughty telling you with lockdowns, but the only sort of impact on my life is when I go to a cafe and want to sit in the outdoor space. Even though there might be spare seats, there are limits on the numbers per space. So, you know, that's the impact on my life in terms of COVID. And this public lecture I was at last night, we had, it was around 6, it was to a particular community in Canberra. It was, well, to the Jewish community here, it was that we had 60 people turn up. And I guess the only way was that you could tell is that the seats were apart and there was hand sanitizer everywhere. But otherwise, we are living a relatively normal life. So it is possible if you are able to get the transmission right down.
Well, Kim, I have a piece coming out in Georgetown Journal of Gender and the Law with Naomi Kahn, where
Yes.
we're just lamenting toxic masculinity and how, you know, the nations with the best COVID response are often headed by
Yes.
women. And
Yeah.
here we are with Trump caught on his thing saying, people are tired of COVID. They want to get on with their lives. I mean, it's just, that's all we have to do is just, you know, let them, we're done with it, you know, so.
Well, I appreciate that in that I very much want him to get on with his life.
Yes.
So if that's the plan, I'm in.
Back to that TV venture he was hoping for 4 years ago.
Yeah.
So it's 6 o'clock, guys. Let me know when
Yes.
to hit the broadcast. Are you ready, Dan? Can I start to broadcast?
I am so ready. I've never been more ready for
Okay,
anything.
3,
in my
2,
adult life.
1. On.
Great.
I think it usually takes a couple of minutes to populate the site, so I'll wait for that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I tried to get Jim to join, so we'll have at least one person maybe.
Welcome to people who are joining. You are indeed at the right place. We're going to wait a minute or two just to let the site populate and the numbers stop rising, and then we'll begin. Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Daniel Canstrom. I'm a professor of law at Boston College Law School, where I also serve as the faculty director of the Rappaport Center for Law and Public Policy, and the co-director of the Center for Human Rights and International Justice. It's an honor and a pleasure and a privilege to moderate this event, which is sponsored and organized by the Clow Center for the Study of Constitutional Democracy. We're gathered here to learn about and to discuss critically and collegially a most interesting, fascinating book, written civil rights law, and it's been published by Oxford University Press this year in 2020. It has a wonderful cover, which you can see here, with excellent artwork on it. I know there's a story there too. And it's really an interesting book to read, and I urge everybody who's attending to read it and to purchase it and to think about it. In this work, Professor McClain argues that although denouncing and preventing bigotry is a shared political value with a long history, people have long disagreed over who is a bigot and what makes a belief, an attitude, or an action bigoted. In fact, as she explains artfully throughout the book, the controversies over the usage of the term bigotry extend to what some would view as its very opposite. A common rejoinder against those who call out certain forms of bigotry is that they themselves may be accused of bigotry as a variant of what some denominate intolerant political correctness, with quotation marks around all of that. The book addresses these and other puzzles about bigotry by tracing it as a rhetorical mode across a range of debates relating to race, religion, marriage, anti-discrimination law, etc. Such puzzles include these. Can a sincere religious belief be bigoted? Is the bigot a distinct type of personality, or is everyone a bit bigoted? Is bigotry simply the term that society gives to repudiated beliefs that are now beyond the pale? And what does it really mean to brand someone as a bigot? As I think you can see from the very outset, these are wide-ranging, deep, complex questions. Most simply, as one reviewer noted, Professor McClain's book is therefore, quote, required reading for anyone who wants to understand our polarized society and how we got here, end quote. So to engage with this book and with these many related issues, we are lucky to have a stellar panel. Let me introduce them all now. In the interest of time, I'll be brief, but please know that the high quality of their work, their reputations, and their credentials far exceed my minimal description. So I apologize to them all. I am going to be a bit brief. First is Professor McClain herself. She is the Robert Kent Professor of Law at Boston University. Professor McClain is well known and well respected for her work in family law, gender and law, and feminist legal theory. She's the author of several books and numerous scholarly articles and book chapters. Her scholarship addresses the respective roles of families, other institutions of civil society, and of government in fostering citizens' capacities for democratic and personal self-government. She has engaged with prominent communitarian, civic, Republican, and feminist critiques of liberal legal and political theory, and offered a reconstructive liberal feminist approach to such matters as privacy, family, and marriage, reproductive issues, and welfare law. Her work also addresses sex equality as a legal and constitutional commitment and public value, the responsibility of government to promote equality and societal tensions over equality and its relationship to other values. Our first responder, thank you for being a first responder, that's very important, so to speak, is my colleague, Professor Katharine Young of Boston College Law School. She's a professor of law whose excellent scholarship focuses on comparative constitutional law, economic and social rights, constitutional theory and positive state obligations, international human rights law, and public law and gender. Professor Young's monograph, entitled Constituting Economic and Social Rights, is published by Oxford University Press in 2012 and is part of the Oxford Constitutional Theory series. She has also edited The Future of Economic and Social Rights by Cambridge University Press and The Public Law of Gender, also Cambridge University Press, with Kim Rubenstein. Professor Young teaches contract law, feminist legal theory, and human rights. Our second responder, whom we have to thank for being out of sync time-wise, but I've just learned it's the morning for her, so that's pretty good, but still 12 hours or so different, has quite generously agreed to join us from Australia. Professor Rubenstein is an Australian legal scholar, legal practitioner, fellow of the Australian Academy of Law, and fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. She is a well-known, widely respected gender equity advocate who won the 2013 Edna Ryan Award for Leadership for, quote, leading feminist changes in the public sphere, unquote. In 2020, Professor Rubenstein became the inaugural co-director academic of the 50/50 by 2030 Foundation at the University of Canberra and a professor in the university's Faculty of Business, Government, and Law. She is one of Australia's leading experts on citizenship, having written the major text, Australian Citizenship Law, and appearing as legal counsel in citizenship matters before the Administrative Review Tribunal, Federal Court of Australia, and the High Court of Australia. She has authored over 100 publications and is regularly called upon by print, radio, and TV media for comment on both citizenship and gender matters. So before I turn things over to Professor McClain, who will begin by talking about her book, I thought I might start with an example of why her book is so important. And it's just a vignette that I happened to encounter as I was rereading the book in preparation for this event. I took a break to read the Sunday New York Times, and there I saw an article by Michael Powell entitled, quote, "White Supremacy Once Meant David Duke and the Klan, Now It Means Much More," end quote. As Powell notes, quote, "In a time of plague and protest, two words, white supremacy, have poured into the rhetorical bloodstream with force and power. With President Trump's overt use of racist rhetoric, a spate of police killings of Black people, and the rise of far-right extremist groups, many see the phrase as a more accurate way to describe today's racial realities, with older descriptions like bigotry or prejudice considered too tame for such a raw moment," end quote. This, I thought, could be an interesting jumping off or jumping in point as a general background question, maybe a rhetorical question for our discussion. Are bigotry and prejudice now somehow tame concepts? Is white supremacy a more accurate, less tame description of the challenges we face in these contentious arenas of race, religion, gender, etc.? More generally, is bigotry a meaningfully analytic, critical concept compared with, for example, institutional or structural racism? We will, I am sure, engage with these questions and much more tonight. So let us begin. Professor McClain has agreed to speak for about 15 minutes. After that, we'll have a response from Professor Young for about 5 to 7 minutes. Then Professor Rubenstein will offer her first response of about 5 to 7 minutes. After this, in what one might call a dialogical, trialogical, or quadrilogical iterative move, we will have Professor McClain respond to the responses for about 5 to 7 minutes. As I hope everybody's keeping track. And to sum things up, we will then return to Professor Young for 5 minutes, to Professor Rubenstein, and then to Professor McClain for a final summation and response. Our plan after that is to open this up to the audience, all of you, so please submit your questions through the Q&A function on Zoom, and I will present them to Professor McClain and our panelists for responses and elaborations. One more note, this is being recorded, so please take note of that. And with no further ado, I am happy to turn it over to Professor Linda McClain.
Okay, Dan, thank you so much. Thank you to Vlad Purdue for his work with the center and in organizing this. Thanks to Katie, thanks to Kim. I really look forward to this. Now, I don't want to take 15 minutes because it sounds like we have a lot of different things to try to get done in a short hour. So I will maybe talk for no more than 10 minutes and just talk a little bit about Dan's question he put to me. I really am grateful for a chance to talk about the book. This was one of the many events that was, the live event was canceled due to the pandemic, and it's not optimal to have a book come out the first month of it, or the first, in March of 2020, but I really appreciate the chance to talk with you all. I finished writing this book in late 2019. If I were finishing it now, I'd have so many additional things to write about, unfortunately, the events of this past year. But I wanted to try to dig in on a few of the questions that Dan put. One of the things I wrestled with the entire time I worked on this book was whether bigotry is a useful analytical concept or whether it's hopelessly provocative, right? Just like Dan talked about, you say someone else is a bigot and they turn around and call you a bigot, and it's kind of just reversing the charges of bigotry. And we see that very clearly at work in some of the rhetoric about religious liberty and civil marriage equality. Recently, in a case involving the Kentucky clerk Kim Davis, the Supreme Court denied cert on her appeal of the circuit court conclusion that while she had sovereign immunity for her failure to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples after Obergefell, she did not have qualified immunity, and she appealed that. And the Supreme Court denied cert, but two justices, Alito and Thomas, took the occasion to remind everyone that they had warned that Obergefell, the civil marriage equality case from 2015, was going to have the effect of branding believers as bigots. So they must have mentioned bigotry 10 times at least in these 2 or 3 page concurrence, basically saying, we warned you, believers would be branded as bigots and treated as bigots, and Kim Davis is certainly a victim, but she's not the last victim. You know, so the language has continuing rhetorical power in this context of Supreme Court rhetoric. And one of the reasons I wrote the book is I was really interested in Justice Scalia sort of in these gay rights cases claiming the court was branding traditional believers as bigots. So in a sense, the work sort of plays a kind of a potent argumentative role in saying, hey, I'm a sincere believer, but you're saying I'm a bigot. One of the things I talk about in the book is that definitionally, it's not inconsistent to have a sincere belief, but to be a bigoted one, because there's many examples of people having sincere religious beliefs about racial supremacy or anti-Semitism that they claim is rooted, you know, fully in scripture. But to get more to the question about what the word means, back in the 40s and 50s, when social scientists were really wrestling with how to make sense of prejudice, how to diagnose the roots of prejudice, how to eradicate prejudice. They had Jim Crow and racism at home. They had World War II and anti-Semitism in Germany, and you know, terrible campaigns of Hitler. They wanted to keep the next epidemic of prejudice from breaking out. They thought of prejudice as an epidemic. They more typically use the rhetoric of prejudice, but they would sometimes talk about the rhetoric of bigotry. So it had enough meaning as a category that people would talk about, you know, what are the mental characteristics of the bigot, for example? You know, what distinguishes the bigot from the ordinary person? And one of the puzzles in the book is the tension between recognizing prejudice as the outgrowth of ordinary cognitive processes. You know, the blink, what happens in the blink of an eye, you know, the automatic associations people make, versus a particular personality type who's prone to, you know, projection or faulty assumptions or can't correct their initial wrong impressions. So there's this tension within the social science literature going all the way back to Gordon Allport's classic work about how to think about bigotry. Is it a distinct type of person, or is it just something that results from the way the brain works? And certainly when Congress was debating the Civil Rights Act of 1964, proponents of the Civil Rights Act said, our spirit is not narrow bigotry. So at that time in the 60s, people thought this word had some moral power. You know, it's time to end racism and bigotry that are perpetuated through, you know, laws that prohibit people from being served, or customs that prohibit them from being served based on race. I think one of the things I found today is it's still used as a term that seems to have some meaning, and yet it's very provocative. For example, in 2019, Congress passed a resolution condemning bigotry. It listed about 12 examples, including white supremacy, and it was passed on bipartisan terms, but there were some Republicans that voted against it, and some complained that it didn't include certain groups, like it didn't include Christians, or it didn't include people with disabilities, you know. So, but it was enough of a concern that certain rhetoric was stirring up bigoted attitudes and inflaming violent behavior that something had to be said. So I think we still have this tension between the need for an emphatic declaration, we don't support bigotry, we condemn bigotry in all its forms, and then there's some debate about what the forms are. But obviously there's a lot of other synonyms you could use. You could use white supremacy, you could use anti-Semitism, you could use you know, homophobia, you could use lots of different words, anti-immigrant sentiment. So one question is, why use a word like that when you have other words? I think, and I'll just take a couple more minutes and then stop. I think one of the problems during the Trump administration has been, while it used to be the case that we would have some sense that a political leader would come out and condemn hatred or bigotry, Trump does that for about 2 minutes and then he's back onto something else. So for example, we've had all these terrible shootings, often which seem to be motivated by hatred of some kind, hatred of Jews, hatred of blacks, hatred of immigrants. You know, we've had that person sending those bombs to all those people that he saw that Trump criticized. So everyone wants Trump to come out and make a public statement, you know, beginning with Charlottesville, come out against it, say something about it. And he seems to say something, but then it's not unequivocal. And then he kind of says, oh, well, Antifa is much worse, right? Or when there was the Christchurch killing, he thought those white supremacists were a pretty small group. He didn't really think it was a big problem, right? His own administration has said white supremacy is the most threatening form of domestic terrorism, but then he's talking about Antifa. So we can't even like have a consistent message. And with the George Floyd murder and the protest around racial justice, I wrote a short blog for Oxford, sort of trying to explore some of the themes of the book and how they may apply to that. And the title of the blog was "Why Talk About Bad Actors Versus Good People Misses the Problem of Systemic Racism." So when you say, well, there was just a few bad apples, you miss broader structural problems. And one thing that's happened repeatedly has been this notion that if you try to talk about institutional racism, you're saying millions of people are bigots. Pence and Trump have both kind of said that. So I think if I were to write this, like a coda to this book now, I would come back and look a little bit about some of these problems, because even though Trump said we need to confront bigotry and prejudice wherever they appear, he then went right on to say, we'll make no progress and heal no wounds by falsely labeling tens of millions of decent Americans as racists or bigots. You see the provocative power of the term there. You know, as soon as you talk about bigotry, you're saying people are bad, right? But people hear charges of systemic racism as a charge that you're a bad person. So I'm going to stop there because I really would like to hear what my panelists have to say about the book, and I'm happy to answer any questions later. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. That was a very excellent beginning. And we'll turn now to Professor Katie Young for a first response of about 7 minutes or so, Katie, and then Professor Rubenstein, and then we'll come back to Professor McClain.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Linda, and thank you to Kim also. It's wonderful to be on this panel and really discussing such a rich book. I'm going to ask a question. My first, I think, really identifies that coda, I think, that you'd be writing now. I really appreciate the book, the way that you're able to weave an analysis of bigotry, both in terms of how it operates as a discourse and a labeling and branding exercise. And also you don't stop there, you kind of go to unpack the logic of bigotry. And I think these are really, really important and really generative moves that the book does. As a frame of discourse, you note, as you just reported, its flippability, the fact that as we try to discipline extremist speech and hostile, contemptful, hatred-fueled speech, at the same time we're seeing that very move being labeled as intolerant and even bigotry. And so this is an incredibly interesting analysis of the discourse and why, I guess it helps us understand why this is happening and why it's so inflammatory and such a conversation stopper. I really appreciate the kind of light that draws on the subject. And then as you unpack the logic of bigotry, I think the book is a very rich analysis of different strands of hatred and contempt, intolerance and animus. And I think weaving out what's particular about bigotry kind of helps understand what's also similar about all these different facets of very highly emotive speech. So I think the book reminds me of other recent works. As I was reading it, you have some really also very illuminating studies of other concepts, but much older concepts that we can now see with new vantage points. And I was reminded of Isabel Wilkerson's book on caste and racism as I read this, as well as Kate Mann's book on sexism and misogyny, and how it can help us to really unpack and understand the history and shifting terrain of these concepts. So my question really comes at this vantage point we're now occupying, the fact that we're peering down an election that's very unpredictable and very unprecedented, and is really operating in a way that is distinctive from the 1950s and the 1960s civil rights debates that you describe. And it's distinctive also from the early gay rights cases and the rhetoric there. And what I think is particularly distinctive, I think many would agree, is the role of the internet and this kind of internet-fueled, mobilized politics that we have, and the kinds of speech that are promoted. And so there's a lot of studies about what is it about the web that promotes kind of bigoted speech or hatred-fueled speech, whether it's social media radicalization or it's the easy spread and cheap spread of misinformation and disinformation. It's also being described as a hijacking of the American conversation. I think it's very interesting. And we see even in this kind of internet context, a lot of the same tropes of the bigoted anti-bigot, the sexist anti-sexist, and this comes out, I think, well in the Gamergate controversy, for example, where one side was calling out sexism and then it in turn was labeled as a sexist move. So I think there's a lot about the current context that your book sheds light on, but my particular question would be on what you see as any connection between what is the clickbait, what is the fueling of the spread of this kind of discourse, and what you identify as bigotry. If your book helps us understand these kinds of newer connections, and if it does, how would you describe those connections? So I think we have a chance to hear from you, or the moderator might want Kim's question posed first before you respond to that question about the internet and bigotry.
Well, if I have in fact been given that authority, I'm going to turn it over to Professor McClain, because we can do this either way. If you wanted to respond right away, that would be fine. And if not, we can have both of them go and then respond.
Yeah,
together.
I think the internet is yeah, it's really, it's so critical, you know, because, you know, one of my favorite essays about bigotry is back from 1944. And it's by Gordon Allport. I mean, you all know it because you read the book, but it's called The Bigot in Our Midst. And it's kind of a warning that appears in Commonweal magazine, right? And he sees what's going on with Hitler, and he's warning about the power of demagogues to stir people up and to make them accept these theories about their condition of resenting all these other groups. Now, just think of the amplifying power of the internet. Like if the demagogue could stir up resentments to a dangerous level, because his view is there's always going to be some residual level of bigotry, and it can flare up and be made worse in wartime, in times of stress and conflict, and, you know, the demagogue and so forth and so on. And the way to counter it, he said, is political leaders, education, you know, religious leaders, civic leaders, everybody just kind of do a counter force, you know, for democratic values. So what do you do on the internet, though, where it's, and I'm not an expert at all on the internet. I mean, you know, I have colleague Daniel Citron who does a lot of work on it. I know some people are from legal systems where there's actually laws that would limit your ability to engage in hateful expression. I do know that the Christchurch call, as I understand it, was for social media giants to show more responsibility in terms of what kind of stuff is allowed to be on the web. But I do think that the power of the internet just exponentially multiplies the problems that people identified even pre the web in terms of stirring up. And I think one thing that some of this classic social science work on prejudice didn't really have was the extreme political polarization and distrust of science and distrust of any, well, I shouldn't say that because there's always competing views about what science was, but this kind of just discounting of expertise and discounting, and, you know, you're allowed to have your own facts. So I don't have a really great answer to that, except it does seem that the ability to, I have a student who's writing a paper about the incel communities. You know, these men who are involuntarily celibate and really have a lot of hatred toward women because of it, and kind of find each other and are able to do this on the internet, you know, and kind of meet and develop and you know, kind of brew all their anger and stuff and resentment. So I don't have a great answer to that. And I wonder, Katie, if you have any thoughts about, you know, what one does that maybe Professor Rubenstein does.
Yeah, let me suggest that let's bring in our second responder, and I think we can weave these conversations together. I do think one of the nice things about this topic is that it has many interconnected strands, and perhaps we'll be able to illustrate that through the conversation. So Kim, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you. Thanks, Dan. And thank you, Katie and Linda and Vlad and the Class Centre for enabling me to participate. The original intention, as Linda said, is that we would have all been doing this in March in person, and it would have been lovely to have the opportunity to continue the conversations beyond the format of the hour. But for my beginning, I guess my sense of my role here is to think about this also in a comparative context, and to think, is this language and framing that is obviously relevant and very poignant in the US at the moment, something that is helpful in all communities that are dealing with forms of racism, anti-Semitism, misogyny. And in coming to the book, Linda, and reading the very opening segment, which is about a person who writes to the paper a Dear Abby sort of story, saying that they'd been at a cocktail party and they'd heard some anti-Semitic comments, and they were Jewish, but they'd married a Gentile, and they hadn't said anything, and should have they said anything? And that actually took me back to not a dissimilar period in the early 70s, growing up in Melbourne, Australia, which has one of the largest Jewish communities in Australia, but compared to US terms is much smaller, around 50 or 60,000 out of several million. At that stage in the 70s may have been around 3 or 4 million. And I'd started off at a Jewish day school and moved to a non-Jewish day school at the age of 8. And not that long after, in the playground, literally playing with some of the other girls, it was an all-girls school, someone dropped some money and someone went to pick it up, and one of my good friends turned to that person and said, "Don't be Jewy." And I just looked at her and instinctively said, "What do you mean by that?" I think I literally just didn't understand. I said, "I'm Jewish. What do you mean by that?" And her response was, "I'm not sure. My parents say it." And it sort of speaks to the intergroup commentary in your book about the value of intergroup relationships, not necessarily in marriage, but in terms of engagement with ideas. And my instinctive reaction was to question and to try and understand what was going on there. And I just want to jump forward to the point that I want to make of the role of law in policing conscience, which is the sort of the point that I'm getting to in this first contribution, is later on in my schooling, in fact, in my final year of school, so by the time, that one was around when I was 8 or 9, but by the time that I was 16 or 17, I was selected in our state school debating team, and I was the one girl and 3 boys, and we were doing a practice run of one of those 1-hour debates where you get the topic an hour before and you go straight out. So we're eating, there was a box of what you would call cookies, I would say biscuits, and one of the other team members went to take the last one, and one of the other team members said to him, "Don't be Jewy." And I looked at him and I said, "Stephen," and I can name him and I'll tell you the story why. I said, "What do you mean by that?" He said, "I was only joking." And I said, "You can't joke about those things." And I went into an explanation about the Holocaust and so forth. And that actually went out of my mind for years until he later contacted me, and I'll come back to this in my last iteration of a broader point, to say that he had never thought about what he was saying, and that response, that just immediate engaged response, made him rethink his language in a more profound way. And so I think the answer is, and then the next point that I would make is that even though I'd had those personal experiences and have worked in areas to do with exclusion and notions of membership and exclusion, I don't think I would ever have used the term bigotry. I think I would have always gone to name those utterances for what they were, whether they be anti-Semitism or racism or misogyny. And in fact, and this brings it to the Australian context, the first time that I actually thought consciously about the term bigotry was a few years ago in public discussion in Australia about the Racial Discrimination Act. And this is where the point about law as being a frame for bolstering conscience and reducing prejudice. In Australia, and in terms of the structural framework of Australia, there is the capacity to legislate in a way to legislate against hate speech. And Section 18 of the Racial Discrimination Act, which is a federal federal piece of legislation, and I'm just seeing if I can. No, I can't copy it into the chat function, but it actually makes it unlawful for a person to do an act in private where that act is reasonably likely to offend, insult, humiliate, or intimidate another person or a group of people on the basis of race, colour, or national or ethnic origin. Now, that has been in the Racial Discrimination Act since the 1970s, but 5 years ago, the more conservative ranks of our Conservative Party sought to repeal that section. Now, what was interesting was what flowed from that in terms of the discussion about that, and an Indigenous Member of Parliament sought to put into the argument how helpful that piece of legislation was. And one of the Conservative members of Parliament responded to say that people do have a right to be bigots, you know. In a free country, people do have right to say things that other people find offensive or insulting or bigoted. And that was the first time that I'd actually, in my sort of intellectual and engagement, had thought about the term bigotry as the broader encapsulator of those terms. And I think my own instinctive reactions are to not lump them all together and to not use, as you said, the more provocative and perhaps inaccurate language, because it doesn't necessarily capture what may be going on in certain circumstances, and that law can be a useful tool to be regulating that behaviour in a way that brings out the variations and perhaps what we'll come back to later, the more institutional frameworks. So I guess the question that flows, Linda, is what were you thinking? I mean, obviously when you're thinking about writing this, you're thinking in broad terms, but to the extent that there are comparative or broader universal claims as opposed to the specific US claims here, do you think looking at the ways in which other countries have dealt with these issues might be useful for the US?
I would like to add a friendly amendment to that question, which I think is excellent, and I want to give Linda plenty of time to answer it. But it also strikes me that implicit in what you were asking is the question of how does law actually relate to this?
Yes.
To what extent is bigotry a legal concept? How much can law regulate that? Of course, those are huge questions, but maybe they're connected, and perhaps connected, in fact, not perhaps, definitely connected to Katie's question about the internet as well, because this question of regulating speech is
Yes.
obviously most salient there right now. So Linda, may I turn it back to you? And before I do that, I want to remind people in the other participants to please, if you have questions, post them in the Q&A function. I see one has already been posted, but just put them in a queue, as they say in other systems, and we'll try to address them as we get closer to the end.
Yeah, thanks for those remarks and for those anecdotes. I know, to my mortification, when I was a young person, single digits, living in Toledo, Ohio, I made some anti-Semitic reference, and my Catholic white friend who had a Jewish boyfriend, and I said it in his presence, and she just looked at me like aghast, like, what? You know, and this is just something I heard, you know, why was I saying that? So that is, there, and that's part of the notion that children, well, I mean, I think Obama once retweeted someone like Mandela saying no one's born a bigot or something, or maybe it was Archbishop Tutu. But I mean, like children aren't born bigots. I mean, children aren't born prejudiced. It's socialization, education, and they pick up certain things. So I think that your example suggests it is education may be possible. The right to be bigoted. This has come up a lot in terms of concerns about religious liberty with civil marriage equality, that somehow if a merchant has to serve a customer and to create a good for that customer violates their religious beliefs, their liberty is being infringed and their conscience is being violated. And if you tell them they have to provide that good, you're basically calling them a bigot. You know, so in other words, even though anti-discrimination law doesn't speak in terms of you can't discriminate against people on the basis of bigotry, it's very specific, right? Race, color, nationality, whatever. It's if you have to comply with that law despite your religious beliefs, then you respond, hey, to make me comply with this law is to treat me as a bigot, right? Now these laws look to conduct, although some people say that having to create a customized good is an act of speech, right? So there's that whole thing there. But in terms of the right to be a bigot, here I read that excerpt you sent me from 2015, and a lot of those examples are you can't engage in. If I understand it correctly, it could also be speech that humiliates someone, right? It's not just act, but it can actually speech act. So that's one distinction right now between the US and these other legal systems, is we still think that there's this realm of speech. Now there's exceptions, but there's generally this realm, you know, where we think people should be able to say these things because of the First Amendment, even though they may be hateful things and they may be irresponsible things and destructive things. And I think that's one thing that, excuse me, builds on the discussion we were having earlier with Katie about the internet and what sort of speech passes into the category of creating a clear and present danger or inciting people to unlawful action and stuff like that. I think the comparative questions are very interesting. And, you know, at one point, I fully intended to have a comparative chapter. I did an awful lot of reading about how different legal systems were handling the marriage equality debates. And then I think what happened is so much had already been written about religious liberty. I really didn't think that I was going to be likely to say anything new about that. So I decided not to go that route. But I think it's certainly a good thing to look at sort of going forward in terms of what are some of the institutional, issues. Those of us who are on campuses, we know that there's a lot of issues right now about students and the classroom climate and the way that students are feeling and the way that they want to have more protection against what they consider to be microaggressions or sometimes more outright aggression, you know, that may be speech acts by other students. And obviously there we're talking more about campus codes and academic freedom than First Amendment per se, but I do think that I haven't gotten to the Sunday magazine yet, Dan, but it said something like free speech can save us or something, right? So there's still that sort of view that, you know, there's this place for robust speech. So I think the right to be a bigot could mean I have the right to hold a view and to express my view, right? And in Australia, it sounds like the lines are drawn differently than they are here on that. But if it means I have a right to engage in conduct of certain kinds, right, then the answer could be, no, you don't. And if that conduct violates a civil rights law or violates other kinds of law, you don't. In the debates over the Civil Rights Act of 1964, some opponents of the Civil Rights Act said, you know, people have a right to be nasty. They have a right to be bigoted. On the other hand, you know, if they don't want to serve a particular customer, they should be allowed to act on that. You know, that's their property rights, that's their liberty rights, that's their freedom of association rights. So these are rights that are somehow protected and that shouldn't be infringed upon. One of the one of the op-eds that was repeatedly cited in the congressional record was this piece by Lawrence Eldridge on the right to be nasty, right? Like, we may morally condemn racism, but people should, in our country, people have the liberty and freedom of association to act as they see fit. And if they don't want to wait on certain people, they don't have to. Now, obviously, the Civil Rights Act rejected that, right? But that was an argument that was made. On the other hand, some opponents of the Civil Rights Act simply flipped charges and said, you all are the real bigots. You're the anti-bigot bigots. So, you know, once again, we see how the term can be flipped in lots of different ways. So I'll stop there because I'm going to get a drink of water, and some of you may also have things you want to follow up on.
Thank you. Let me turn it back to Katie for maybe a further iteration of the questions that you had posed, or if you have other questions to move the conversation forward. This can be our last round, and then we can see if there are questions being posted in the Q&A.
Great, thank you. And I might follow up on exactly those points about religious liberty and also the global kind of comparative setting in which we find ourselves. I think this panel might be unusual to have two Australians commenting. This is a smaller panel than the original iteration, but I know you've had a lot of attention in an American context with the book. I want to draw this question out to a kind of the global setting. We can point to Australia. We can point to a few other places like Canada and various countries in Europe which regulate hate speech and ensure that, you know, certain speech that might pass over to this category of bigotry isn't protected, constitutionally protected speech. And we can look at different comparative forms of regulating internet platforms too as publishers. But I want to take this question to a different comparative setting, which is remarked upon in your book, the context of a backsliding in constitutional norms and legislation protective of certain guardrails of democracy, the needs for a functioning and healthy democracy. And in this sense, I want to point both to the religious connotations, you know, your background in law and religion and the book's sensitive treatment of religious liberty arguments and religious accommodations, and what we're seeing now with a kind of backsliding of really kind of global trending. Over the last decade, we've seen really marked decreases in a range of civil and political human rights indicators, as well as economic, social, and cultural rights indicators. We see various women's rights being retrenched after previous gains, women's equality rights, sexual and reproductive rights. We see also clampdowns on the LGBT community. And so this is kind of global. We see expressions that come out and are really parallel with a lot of the populist rise. We're seeing that a lot of electoral success can be gained by populist leaders employing a rhetoric that has various tropes of xenophobia and sexism and racism and perhaps this bigotry. And so I wanted to ask you particularly about, you know, what we're seeing in Bolsonaro's Brazil or in Putin's Russia or in Erdogan's Turkey or Orban's Hungary. We're actually seeing legislative retrenchments of those protections in various guises, which has been self-described as kind of anti-gender ideology, kind of pushback against this gender, support for gender equality. And here, I really found in your book some really interesting analyses of what the role of religious rhetoric has been playing here in the United States, and how religion has combined with various political arguments. Do you see this as helpful in understanding these trends? Do you see your book informing that global context of backsliding and populism and a combination of religion in politics? Or would you say that this book is really a book about America? This is America's history to own. This is a concept that really draws the best light on the American context, and what might be going on elsewhere really has less in common with those forms of religious rhetorics or those forms of racism or sexism. This is a book for America, or is it of comparative import? What would you say?
Well, I'm pretty sure my publisher wants me to say it's of comparative importance, of course. But no, I think that the idea of backsliding is an interesting one. It's one that's been used in the U.S. in terms of, you know, this concern that white supremacists are coming out of the shadows, that rhetoric is licensing positions we thought were off the table, and now suddenly they're back. But gender is an interesting context because one thing I point out in the book is you don't see bigotry, at least in the US discourse, used to refer to sexism nearly as much as you do to homophobia or racism or anti-Semitism. And there has been a surge in using the word misogyny, right? There was an interesting piece in the Times about, and Kim, I don't know, you do work on gender equity, probably, you know, there may be parallel developments where misogyny is becoming the umbrella term, right? Where everything's kind of, included under that rather than bias or sexism. Now, in terms of gender, I want to say something because I saw there was a question in the chat about what's the difference between conviction and bigotry. When you look definitionally at what makes something bigoted, one definition is it's an unreasonable position. It's an unreasonable view about a particular group of people or their beliefs, right? So that goes more to, is there a basis for the belief? And John Corvino, who's a philosopher, has talked about bigotry as a form of epistemic bad hygiene. You know, like you don't have a reasonable basis for your belief. And so conversely, if your belief is reasonable, then it shouldn't be called bigoted, right? Now, if you think about gender and the debates in the US around gender identity, because as you may know, the Obama administration had made some gains in terms of having a more inclusive definition of gender, but then the Trump administration rolled it back. But some of the arguments, sorry, I thought somebody needs to take that landline off, sorry. Some of the arguments made in the gender identity context are biology is not bigotry. So if there's a biological basis for the belief that sex is binary, MF, and there's nothing in between, and what you are at birth is what you are, then that's biology, and that's not bigotry. Now, of course, the comeback is that's not an accurate understanding scientifically of how people think about gender identity, you know, and of the relationship between biological sex at birth and people's sense of gender identity. But the argument would be, if it's biology, it can't be bigotry. Or the idea would be, if I have a religious belief that God created two sexes and sex is a gift, then that's my sincere religious conviction. And you're branding me a bigot, you know, if you somehow tell me that that belief, you know, cannot be acted upon, right? That we can't instantiate that belief into law, say, right? Like with bathroom bills or things like that. So I do think that, and I think there's probably some parallel developments in other systems where the battleground over gender, it feels like the stakes are very high to people, right? Because they think somehow that they're going to be branded as bigots because they take the view that there's men and women, right? So that's kind of some version of that argument. But if a belief is, if it's the unreasonableness of something that makes it, an unreasonable belief about a group that makes it, say, a bigoted belief, then, you know, presumably you have to talk about what is a reasonable belief. And one of the problems here, of course, is our scientific understanding changes, and we have a fairly shocking and not to some though, but a fairly disheartening and really terrible history of using science to justify all sorts of forms of discrimination that we, you know, luckily eventually came to see were not reasonable. But there's always this, reasonableness is not a solution necessarily, but it does help you to kind of sort out. Now, finally, I just want to say that in this regard, the Gorsuch opinion in Clayton was quite interesting, because Justice Gorsuch has expressed a great deal of sympathy for religious believers in the gay marriage context. But in the Title VII case, where he concluded that discriminating based on gender identity or based on sexual orientation inevitably and necessarily is discrimination based on sex, he expressed a particular understanding of the relationship between sex and sexual orientation and gender identity. Now, he did say, we're not addressing the religious liberty issue in this case because it's not race. So obviously that could be the next case. But it did seem to accept that there's a particular understanding about what sex means. And on that understanding, you know, if you treat an employee differently because they bring a man to a party versus a woman to a party as their date, or because they dress like this way versus that way, then that's discrimination based on sex. I think that's an encouraging sign, but of course, Gorsuch put the religious liberty question to the side, and so we don't know exactly what that's going to mean, practically speaking.
Well, thank you. We have exactly 7 minutes left, which means I'm not going to ask my question about Amy Coney Barrett, although I'm dying to put that out there. But Kim, why don't we give you the last word on this, and then we do have a couple of questions in the Q&A.
Sure, I'll try and reduce it to a few minutes rather than the 7 minutes. But in the comparative context, I'll just give a shout out to this book, which I'm going to put into the chat function now with a link, which is Illicit Love, Interracial Sex and Marriage in the US and Australia by one of our colleagues from the Australian National University, Professor Anne McGrath. And that's obviously one of the areas that you look at, Linda, in relation to responding to bigotry through the enabling of other frameworks for engaging with the issues. And one of the perspectives that Anne takes in this book, which is relevant to the final points that I wanted to make in terms of looking at law and law's role, is she identified, and her interest was looking at intermarriage as a way of dealing with dynamics of sovereignty and kinship. And sovereignty leads me into my thinking about citizenship and my work in citizenship, and the ways in which laws can in fact embed institutional bigotry or racism. I wouldn't have used the word bigotry before, but I would have said have embedded institutional racism. And very briefly, and one of the cases that I'm working on at the moment that's before the full federal court in Australia links back to that institutional racism in the 1970s in Australia, when Australia had sovereignty over Papua New Guinea. And in the transition to independence, the legislation that was framed effectively ruled out from membership in Australia individuals who were non-white Australians. Now, I am running a case at the moment of a person who was born just before independence, who's lived his whole life in Australia with an Australian passport. When going to renew that passport, was told, actually, no, you're not an Australian citizen by virtue of those laws in the 1970s. And the argumentation being put before the court is what I would call white Australia policy that led into that legislation. And I think that leads into, Linda, your discussion about bigotry's backward and forward-looking dimensions, and how we have to be very cautious in our legislative frameworks in thinking about how laws can in fact institutionalize and perhaps are underpinning some of the areas that we're calling in this discussion in your book is trying to address of bigotry, and how I do stay committed to that notion that education and resisting the use of the term bigotry because of its provocative and perhaps negative connotations and resistance that it causes to openness to thinking through the issues. And I'll perhaps end with that, the follow-up to that story of the cookie story. The reason why I was reminded of it is that fellow was writing a book on how he became involved in institutional change. And he uses that story as one of the things that opened his mind, which is very humbling, but it also is about how there are ways in which, and his commitment to working in Indigenous rights in Australia, he's an academic in those areas, that when we uncover what is going on underneath the language, that there is the possibility for changing the bigot to a good person, but by resisting the term bigotry.
I just want to give a very quick response to that. When I was finishing up the book last fall, these three couples in Virginia sued the state of Virginia, the Commonwealth of Virginia, because clerks were still requiring people to disclose their race on a marriage application, 50 years after Loving versus Virginia. And the district court opinion striking down this provision of Virginia law as unconstitutional, the district court referred to it as codified racialization and talked about the whole history of racial classification, superiority, inferiority, but also kind of simultaneous with that, the state of Virginia, the governor ordered this commission to basically conduct a race audit where they go through the legislation and they look for laws still on the books that are basically reinforcing racism, reflecting racism, and some of like laws still declaring that schools shall be segregated that have never been taken off the books. So I think that the race audit, just like a gender audit or things, can be a way of looking at the institutional forms, because one understanding of bigotry is it's an unjustified, unreasonable belief about the superiority of some groups over other groups. You have other words you can use to describe that, obviously, but I think that ties in with what you're suggesting. Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks, Linda. We have 2 more minutes. Let me just summarize briefly the 3 questions that were posted, one of which you alluded to already, about the difference between conviction and bigotry. And I think there's a related question to that, which is the difference in implications of the word bigot, which is a somewhat general term, versus more specific terms of racism, homophobia, anti-Semitism. Personally, I might add xenophobia, and the question of whether citizenship itself is a legitimizing construction for all sorts of forms of oppression. And finally, the question of whether this idea of a right to be nasty is more or less a right to go back in time to days when marginalized people or faith communities could be discriminated against routinely without impunity, outrage, sanction, or shaming. And one last thing, one person asked, is it okay to quote the host? Yes. And the panelists, and perhaps quote their remarks in an upcoming article for the BC Gavel, a student-run progressive newspaper. So for me, I say yes. If others could just,
Sure.
is that okay? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, that's fine.
Well, so let me thank everybody. Linda, you can talk us out if you want to address those final questions, and then we'll be done.
Yeah, I think one reason the term bigot, sometimes bigot's used as an umbrella term where people say, well, this person probably hates all those groups, or they probably hold to all those isms. So it's sometimes is a placeholder for referring to someone like, think about Archie Bunker, which maybe is a television reference some of the younger people on this call don't know, but he was America's lovable bigot, supposedly, right? I mean, you're supposed to learn from his foibles, something we could make fun of his prejudices, but there's some concern that actually people might not have drawn that lesson. They might have thought, well, it's okay. But the point is, he had views about everybody, the Polish, the Jews, Black people, whatever. But that term is kind of an umbrella term that may imply someone's beyond redemption, right? One of the reasons that Hillary Clinton, got into some trouble 4 years ago was when she used the term basket of deplorables and said many of those people are not redeemable. Now, to be a person who can't be redeemed is kind of that's not something a lot of people want to think about themselves. And so maybe if we say, we help people try to learn about and unlearn some things, that might be a more hopeful term, but also a more specific term than just saying, well, you're just a bigot. I wash my hands of you. You're just a bigot. I don't want to have anything to do with you anymore. I give up, right? And I guess the right to be nasty, sure. I mean, that was presuming a certain interpretation of American freedom that allowed a particular group to have the freedom to keep others out, right? Out of hotels, out of restaurants, out of other things. And I think that understanding of freedom of association is not consistent with the anti-discrimination laws we have across the country, including in Massachusetts, right? We have a different understanding now of what it means to participate in the marketplace, as a public space where there's certain norms about equality and citizenship that should be adhered to. Okay.
Well, thank you all very much. I think what we've illustrated is that 1 hour is not enough time to have this conversation in its full richness. So I hope we can docket this ahead and continue these conversations in many other fora. Kim, we want you in Boston. We will find a way to get you here. Thank you so much. Linda, thank you so much for writing the book and for continuing the conversation and participating in this. Katie, thank you for everything and for being a wonderful colleague. And to the Clow Center, thank you for organizing this. And to our participants, thank you for joining us.
Okay, thanks to everyone. Virtual hugs. I wish everybody well. Thanks for the conversation. I really appreciate it.
All right. Bye for
Bye
now.
all.
Okay, thanks everyone.